My name is Dr. James Hunter, and I am the Curator of Naval Heritage and Archaeology at the Australian National Maritime Museum. The reason that Newcastle is important to me in maritime archaeology is there is a massive amount of wreck sites here, absolutely immense. You're talking anywhere between 200 and 300 shipwrecks in a relatively confined geographic area. The temporal range of those wrecks runs from 1800 up to the modern day. Sail-driven vessels, steam-propelled vessels, motor-driven, and we're not even getting into the fact that you've also got tanks out there, Second World War, LSTs, that sort of thing. Looking at the earliest shipwrecks here, they are some of the earliest, if not the earliest, wreck sites in New South Wales. So there's a lot there to chew through, and for someone like me, that's awesome. You could spend an entire career working here, easily, and then some.
Off the coast of Newcastle, there are hundreds of wrecks, all the way up and down the coast of Newcastle.
Shipwrecks are such an event. They're a spectacle, they're terrifying, they're about people and lives at risk. It's a natural disaster, it's got everything going on.
It's a stuff of dreams. It makes the mundane become magical in a way. They're full of high drama, the Sygna, the Pasha Bulker. It might be a once-in-a-lifetime generational thing you see.
It is also about, I guess, the failure of a spectacular technology. You know, these ships were of their time, technologically advanced.
It's traumatic for everyone concerned, but it brings the whole town out to not just rescue the people that are in trouble, but also to support the people that are doing the rescuing.
The allure of shipwrecks, if you're a seafarer, is not very bright. If you can avoid them, that's a really good idea. However, they happen all the time.
Susan Gilmore Beach is named after a shipwreck. Catherine Hill Bay is named after a shipwreck. Streets in Stockton are named after shipwrecks.
To find the wrecks is such a relief for a start, because you may be miles and miles out to sea with nothing around you, and you've dived down to the limit that you can dive to, and mostly expecting to find just sand. But if you can find that wreck, then it's just joy to actually find it.
Stories of the people that survived or didn't survive the shipwreck, and you're diving and all that history's around you.
We call it lust for rust. To look at these mighty ships that were once, sailing away, doing their jobs, but are now resting on the bottom of the ocean. It's beautiful to see them.
Newcastle's history is completely intertwined with shipwrecks and calamities because that's what happens when you're a very important coal centre.
Newcastle, its prosperity came from the harbour.
And especially its first 100 years or so until the trains came through in the 1870s. Before that, the only real transport for Newcastle, but also every major town along the coast, was by sea.
At one stage it was, I think, either the 5th or 6th biggest port in the world. Newcastle was the last bastion of sailing ships, because they could always get a cargo.
They stayed and they unloaded their ballast, and then they had to wait sometimes 3 months before they could load coal. I think they said at some stage there was over 100 ships in the port. People have said that you could nearly walk across the harbour with the number of ships in there.
Now, the more shipping that was coming up here, the more they had to safely negotiate the entrance to the harbour.
It was considered to be one of the most dangerous entrances in the world.
There's a very narrow channel there, not much room to navigate, particularly for sailing vessels. You've got to kind of thread the needle, and if you don't thread the needle, or if the conditions are not working in your favor, you're gonna go right into that bank and then you're done.
Ships would, especially under sail, would come in, get caught behind Nobby's Island and suddenly lose power, and if there were big seas they'd get washed into what's now the Stockton breakwall that used to be called the Oyster Bank.
The spine of the breakwater is actually composed mostly of shipwrecks.
If you walk along the breakwater today, you can still see part of the Adolphe sticking out of the water. There are many shipwrecks, including the Cawarra, the Lindis, the Windowry. They're all there.
You can actually get into some of those wrecks, and you might not necessarily know what wreck you're in there.
About 35 shipwrecks in this general area here, probably about 43 down south, and there's 13 mud punts here, dumped as well to make some sort of barrier against the sand which is constantly moving here.
So the significance of Newcastle was it wasn't very deep, so it was a shallow port with all the problems associated with a river port. Because of the biggest ships that BHP got coming in anyway for the steelworks, which was the major inbound one, they dredged it. So that's why it's, what, now 15 metres, I think.
Something had to be done to make the harbour safer for vessels.
The entire harbour's been sculpted in order to help those ships get in here safely.
There was obviously the building of the breakwater, there was the levelling of Nobbies, the construction of the lighthouse, and also the building of the Stockton breakwater as well.
This is the Antipodean version of the Industrial Revolution is being driven from little old Newcastle.
So the other thing they did was build a series of navigational beacons, one of which still stands today, the Lead Light Tower, which is very medieval looking. Everyone probably knows it. It was a really, really important navigational beacon for ships to be able to enter the harbour safely. By triangulation, line up those two towers, and they could tell that they were clear of the bar.
I think something like the Pasha Bulker shows that we're still a vulnerable part of the coast for the maritime industry.
So a lot of people think that European settlement was about the penal settlement, but the Europeans were here trading and doing business here before that.
And seeing the resources that were here, seeing that there was coal, that there were amazing timber resources. Obviously Aboriginal people had been here for many thousands of years, and it wasn't until 1804 that the penal colony was finally established.
One of the earliest wrecks was the Norfolk that was wrecked on the southeast point of Stockton in 1800. It was built in Norfolk Island and it was used by bass and flinders to circumnavigate Tasmania. When it was returned, it was used to carry supplies between the Hawkesbury and Sydney. And in one of those, it was hijacked by 15 convicts and came north to Newcastle, where it foundered on the shore near about where the Lions Park is now. It was referred to as Pirate Point from then on. It's still on the map as Pirate Point.
The wreck that at one time was Australia's biggest maritime disaster was the Cawarra.
So the Cawarra was a merchant steam vessel. In July 1866, it was on its way to Brisbane and Rockhampton from Sydney. During the night, a severe weather system formed off the east coast, what we now know as an east coast low. By the morning, the vessel was in trouble, and the captain realised this, so he tried to turn into the port of Newcastle. As he did that, the vessel was hit by a series of very, very strong, tumultuous waves. The vessel was swamped by seawater and began to founder. People were in serious, serious trouble. Onlookers from Newcastle came out. They lined the sides of the harbour.
People on shore watching and there's nothing they can do.
There were about 20-30 people on the mast collapsed, wild storm. Boat couldn't get nearby, it broke 2 or 3 oars so they couldn't get close to them.
The ship was lost and it foundered on the oyster bank.
The harbourmaster's son, a fisherman, and the assistant lighthouse keeper from Nobbies, they rescued the one survivor, a guy called Frederick Valentine Hedges. What was amazing was that one of the guys that rescued him, he was the only survivor from the famous wreck of the Dunbar in Sydney about 9 years before.
The next day, the seas had settled and the tragic loss of life became evident. 60 people were drowned, lost their lives in that tragedy. There was a public funeral held and there was a procession up to the cemetery. 7 hearses were required.
Then there's a mass grave up at Christchurch. I mean, huge tragic stories that are connected with these wrecks.
So along with the Cawarra and the 17 other vessels that we know were wrecked during that storm, we've also got, in more modern times, the Pasha Bulker storm, the Sygna in 1974. These are all caused by east coast lows. As a result of the sinking, there was a commission of inquiry. The ship was actually overladen and carrying too much cargo. 10 years later, after many, many more tragedies at sea with ships being overladen, there was legislation introduced into British Parliament by a man called Plimsoll. Following on from that and forevermore, A line had to be painted on sides of a vessel to indicate where a ship was likely to be overladen, and that to this day is still used, and it's called the Plimsoll line and is directly connected to the Cawarra. And I've no doubt that that's probably saved many, many more lives since.
I think the Cawarra, because it was such a tragedy, that sort of instigated the formation of the Rocket Brigade.
Around about 1866, Newcastle established the Rocket Brigade in Newcastle.
What the Rocket Brigade did was fired a rocket from the beach with a string on it, and then people on the boat would pull the string and the string would turn into rope, and once you got the rope they'd tie it off on the boat.
And then they had what they call a breeches buoy, and that would be connected to the rope, and they were able to pull it in and out. They were able to move people from the ship to the shore.
Evacuate the boat, rescue everyone.
But you've got to remember that in most cases we're talking cyclonic winds, we're talking rain, driving rain, and of course the sand would cut into their faces. So they've got to try and put all this equipment up in all those conditions and then be able to fire rockets into the wind and be skillful enough to be able to get them out there. They saved many lives. That cart was located in front of the customs house. They needed this cart because the equipment was very, very heavy, and they had to get that equipment down to the sand, down to the beach. They needed something like 10 to 20 men in the crew to get it all down there. So the rocket brigades were an important part of the rescue service, the sea rescue service.
The two critical things that really saved lives in this city during that era were the rocket brigades and the Victoria Lifeboat.
In the earlier years, at the time of the Cawarra, Newcastle realised they needed a bigger lifeboat. They needed a stronger boat, a more dependable boat that the crew could rely on and feel safe in it. It arrived in Australia and it went into service in 1897. They needed lifeboats because we're in the era of sailing ships. They didn't have power. So when the wind disappeared, they're at the mercy of the sea. And of course, you know how big the waves can be at the Pasha Bulker. They were, I think, 14 metres, the waves, enormous. We've always had cyclonic conditions, so we needed a lifeboat. And there was 350 men that served on those lifeboats from the 1838 through to 1946, 109 years.
Brave men who must have been so strong to row a 10-tonne lifeboat out to sea in big seas. It's just beyond belief.
Boatman's Row, people will be familiar with as that extraordinary collection of terraces down near Nobby's. They were home to the crews of the Rocket Brigade and the Victoria Lifeboat, and they were the people who were on call 24 hours a day.
That gun would go off, they dropped everything, they'd run out the door, they'd be putting their coats on and pulling their pants up and heading off down to the shed to get ready to go to sea. They'd sit on the seats, they'd tie themselves down. They had to do that because they didn't want to be washed out. And then once they had themselves tied down, they'd pick up their oars and down the rails they'd go into the water. Sometimes they had to row out to the rescues, but other times the pilot boat would take them out, stand by and bring them back. That was a better option. It was involved in some of the bravest, the most daring lifeboat rescues in the maritime history of Australia.
One of the ships that was undoubtedly saved by the Victoria Lifeboat was the Adolphe.
The Adolphe was one of the most well-known because it happened at the front end of our harbour. It arrived in Australia in 1904 in September. The waves were enormous. There was 2 tugs pulling her in, and the larger tug was on the southern side, and that tow rope broke. So the smaller tug didn't have a hope. The Adolphe got pushed towards the oyster bank, and a very large wave lifted her up, dropped her down hard, and the back of the ship got broken.
Behind me is the wreck of the Adolphe. Beneath that there's about 4 other wrecks, including the Cawarra. and suddenly then the Adolphe crashes on them and is speared by one of the spars.
So when the ship's back was broken, it could have just completely broken and it would have sank in a few minutes. It would have been gone. There was 32 aboard. Luckily, our lifeboat had trained for that scenario, and they very skillfully got out to the Adolphe through all that wreckage that was hidden under the water, and if they'd made one mistake it would have ripped the hull out of that lifeboat. But they managed to get there in those dreadful seas, and they set up their rescue gear and they saved the 32 aboard. So then they had to manoeuvre through that wreckage again, get back into the harbour. By then there was thousands of Novocastrians lining the shores, clapping them, because they'd witnessed the whole thing happen, because it was right at the entrance. And that's why it became very famous. And Newcastle awarded gold medals of bravery to the crew, and the French government gave each crew member a purse of sovereigns to show their appreciation that they saved their crew.
There's this beautiful photograph that was taken, but it's got every character in the story. It's got the crew that we rescued, it's got the people that rescued them, and in the background it's actually got the Adolphe. For me, that photograph tends to sum up the entire story.
Susan Gilmore, 3-mast bark, going from Sydney to Newcastle. By the time they got close to Newcastle, there was a bit of a swell and the weather was changing, the waves were increasing. He chose to have a tug pull them up the coast rather than to use his sails. And of course, again, the tow rope broke. The choice was then to put the sails up and try and make weight, which he did. And of course, the tug said, oh, they're right. So he turned around and headed back to Sydney. As he was trying to make the way, he looked at the shore and he saw a sandy beach. And he said, that's where I'm going. The beach was named after the Susan Gilmore. So he had 3 lifeboats on board. He put the first one in the water, filled up the water, hit the boat and got smashed to pieces. Second one, put that one in the water and a similar thing happened. He had a third one, he put that in the water, put some of the crew, got the wife in and they headed off, and then bang, in the water went the wife, and he got a rope, tied around himself, jumped in the water, saved his wife, pulled her back on board. Next minute there was a guy walking along the headland. Now this is a very steep headland at Susan Gilmore Beach. He worked his way down and he thought he'd swim out. So he stripped all his clothes off and jumped in the water and swam out, and no, that's not going to work. So he came back, put all his gear back on, climbed back up that mountain and ran all his way back to Newcastle to raise the alarm. The minute the alarm was raised, the guns were fired, the lifeboat was out, and the rocket brigade with this cart heading towards the beach. By the time they got there, they had to undo everything, get all the gear off and take it down the cliff. They set it all up and they fired their rockets out and they brought everybody to the shore. Then the captain said, hold it, we've forgotten something. He had to go out and get the canary, had to go out and get the cat, and then the last thing he decided to get was the papers of the ship, which he should have got in the first place. They all survived. They did a good job, the rocket brigade.
I think shipwrecks are a time capsule. And if we think about, the discovery of a shipwreck from 2,000 years ago, we want to see what was on it, what was their treasure.
What is amazing is how much is still there. Shipwreck sites tend to preserve things a lot better. Organic objects that don't survive on land tend to survive very well underwater. So for example, shoes, clothing, and that just tells us more about the past.
All shipwrecks are protected in the New South Wales Heritage Shipwreck Act. Nothing can be removed from a ship.
Heritage protection now about taking stuff from shipwrecks, but in the old days there wasn't, and a lot of divers have got mementos in their garage.
Lots of these early boats have no portholes left because a lot of the early divers considered having a porthole was sort of a bit of a trophy from having dived.
Back in, I think it was the late 50s, 2 American lasses came here and they scoured the backyards of Stockton with a bit of help for people, and these women were after figureheads of the ships. Now some of these have washed ashore, some have been pilfered from other things, but most of the time they just ended up in backyards and rotting. So they went and bought them, and people were very glad to get rid of this firewood sort of thing. They were regarded as the soul of the ship. When the ship went into port they usually dismantle a figurehead if they could, because people might steal it.
Some of these ships lost their propellers and things like that. They got blown off. So there was a fair bit of salvaging done back in the day. As far as treasure goes, most of the ships around Newcastle were either tugboats. A lot of the other ships that did sink were here for trade, especially coal. The only one that had a lot of treasure on it that's in this area would be the Catherton. When it sank, had a lot of gold from the Victorian goldfields on board. One of the big British insurers sponsored a salvage back in the 1800s with hard hat divers, and then they did some more recently in the 90s to make sure there wasn't any more treasure left on it.
One of the most famous shipwrecks after the Cawarra was the city of Newcastle. It's below Shepherd's Hill, near Bar Beach actually. This enormous paddle steamer came up the coast, got a bit confused, turned to port and went straight into a cliff. And they were wedged in this crevice. So basically people could get out. There's some great images of that. And no one was killed, but just wedged in the side of the cliff.
The Berbice was coming into a harbour. It got into difficulties and it kind of got swept around to the beach, and it was about 200 metres off the beach where it became stranded.
Stockton, of course, being on the other side of the harbour, it needed its own rocket brigade, and one of their first saves was the Berbice.
The Rocket Brigade was there pretty quick because the headquarters of the Rocket Brigade was just alongside of them. So they just ran out the door, ran across, had to run up the beach, get all the stuff out of the shed and get down and get it started. But it was at night, it was cyclonic conditions. It was the Stockton Rocket Brigade's first rescue, and they did very well. Everybody aboard was rescued.
Now, I first found the Berbice after NBN TV, where they were talking about drone footage of this thing that looked like a shipwreck out the front of Stockton Surf Club. And part of the trying to identify it, one of the skills I teach in advanced course navigation is to estimate distance by kicking. I did my swim, both lengths of the boat, counted distances. My estimation was in 30 centimetres of the length of the Berbice. Sort of things you train for become useful. So it was a timber ship but with an iron frame. This Berbice definitely had all that, so given the length was right and it was about where it was washed ashore, we assumed that was the Berbice.
The Juristia was similar location, a bit further along the beach. Again, a problem. It was being towed. The tow rope, they believe, got caught up in some of the wreckage and snapped off, and the ship got swept around to the Stockton beach area and it got stranded. And the rocket brigades did the same thing. They fired those rockets, they got everybody off the ship and there was no lives lost. But the lifeboat was there, it was sitting there waiting just to make sure nobody got washed out and they would have picked them up. So each time the two services would work together, and that's how it has to happen. And that's what happens today with our rescue services here today.
Photos from the time of this big ship lying on its side, but now it's completely submerged, very occasionally because some of it stands up, and I've heard of surfers having the fins snapped off their board because they've gone over this wreck. It's a fascinating wreck to dive to.
With shipwrecks, they were so common, and when people were drowned, back home on land, they have wives and parents and kids and things like that. And there were no pension funds in those days. What happened in Newcastle was the establishment of the Newcastle Shipwreck Fund. Came about because of the sinking of the steamer Dandenong off the south coast. Some of the stories that they mentioned as the people were getting off was there was a little girl and she had lost her parents, 3 brothers and 2 sisters. And that sort of tugged at the heartstrings.
The Mayor announced that there would be a fundraising set up. The owner of the Victoria Theatre, John Bennett, he offered his theatre for free. This was 8 days after the ship had sunk. And the program included 15 items. There was a reading called The Thunderstorm, another one called Shipwreck, a solo called Murmur of the Shell, a descriptive song called Wrecked and Saved. We actually have the words of it. The troubled seas like mountains ran, and loud the thunder crashed. The raving waters swept the deck and shivered every mast. All sails were gone, the ship a wreck, and downward sinking fast.
My favourite wreck off Newcastle is the Bonnie Dundee. It's got a great name, for a start. You feel happy about going there, don't you? Tragic story, it was a collision in the middle of the night. Two ships ran into one another, and fortunately the Bonnie was smaller than the other one and suffered more damage and sank. So this is the Bonnie, 5 kilometres straight out from Swansea Channel. It's in a depth of, I think, about 40 metres. Lots of fish life, and yet just acres of sand everywhere else. And quite often you find a lot of sharks, wobbegong sharks, but they don't bother you. But you can see here in this video the swarm of fish around what would have been the boiler. It shows you how busy the harbour was, because these two ships ran into one another in the middle of the night, one coming in, one coming out, one presumes. And the Advance, which is just a little further down south from that, was a story of a tugboat that similarly ran into a ship.
The Advance is sunk off Catherine Hill Bay. Christmas Day 1908, it went down to meet a sailing ship called the Inverna.
It must have been so busy out of Newcastle with ships coming and going. The Advance is one of those stories where we set out on Christmas Day trying to get the trade in competition with another tugboat.
There was a real race between all the tugs to get business. They were all owned by different people.
The skipper of the Advance decides to do a U-turn in front of the schooner because that's the way he can get to the master to yell out his price in pennies per tonne of what he will be taking that ship back to the harbour in. His U-turn is tragic because the ship runs over him.
It collided with the Inverna and sank immediately. The whole crew except for one guy died. One guy that survived held onto a piece of wood and drifted for about 12 hours and ended up on Dudley Beach. Yeah, this poor guy's probably a Christmas to forget. All his mates died and he spent 12 hours in the water.
Comic tragedy nevertheless happened all the way out there at sea.
When I first dived it back in about 97, 98, it looked exactly like photos from Terry Callen's book of how it was in the harbour. Unfortunately, in 2005, one of the big coal ships put its anchor through it and ripped that front part of the boat off. The rest of the boat's sort of sitting there, it's very intact.
The mission that was kind of the most difficult, the one that they all nearly lost their lives on, was the Alpena in 1909. It was coming into the harbour, it got into difficulties, it got moved along into the Stockton Bight. The signal house realised there was a problem and they fired their gun twice. The lifeboat was launched. They got out to the Alpena, but the captain complicated the situation. He didn't want to lose his schooner. He wanted his wife taken into the port, but he wanted to leave himself and the crew on board. So the first rescue started at 9:30 at night. At 5 o'clock in the morning, they arrived back in the port. It took all that time. The mountainous seas, they had to get through those seas, get back into the port. By that time, they were exhausted. Within an hour or so, the flare went up again. The lifeboat had to go again. They got out, they got to the ship, they took the captain and the crew off. There was a little dog on board, a lovely little dog. They couldn't take her. 3 miles off Newcastle, the coxswain said, it could be a big problem. The lifeboat rolled twice. There was only 3 remained in the lifeboat. The other 20 were thrown out into the water. Out the stern of the boat was the coxswain. He signalled to the pilot boat, and they eventually turned and came back and helped recover some of the men that were in the water, and the rest got into the lifeboat. When they arrived back in the harbour, Newcastle was there waiting for them. They hailed them as heroes, and they all received medals of bravery from not only Newcastle, but also from the President of the United States. He issued medals of bravery to the crews. But the drama wasn't over. 2 days after the rescue, the captain heard that there was a salvage team going out for his boat. So he hired a tug, and he headed out for the heads. And the 2 tugs were neck and neck. And luckily, the captain's tug got there before the other, just a whisker. He managed to get back on board his boat and save his boat. He ran into his cabin and he grabbed a rifle and he got out to the front of the boat and he said, "No one else is going to come onto my boat." And then he turned around, the little dog was still there. It's saved. But unfortunately, there was one loss, one terrible loss. And that was just before the captain got into the lifeboat to be saved, he went back to the cabin and picked up his wife's jewellery. It was valuable stuff. So he put it into a hessian bag and shoved it in his pocket, and it was gone. So one day, somebody will be walking along Stockton Beach and they'll find a hessian bag. Good luck.
Lots of ships would actually leave Newcastle and then disappear. Some of them were overloaded, others for a completely different reason.
When some of the ships got loaded and went out of the harbour, they simply disappeared.
The last thing so many of them would have seen would have been nobbies as they head out into the Pacific, and they never turn up. They couldn't understand why. There was inquiries from the British government, and then it was discovered that fire, combustion, just burn out steel ships or wooden ships, lost with all hands.
With spontaneous combustion, that's when the coal heats up, sort of thing. And they were supposed to be flattened out in the holes. In actual fact, they were pretty slack. They used to put it in a pyramid shape, and then you go out and get a storm and the things would shift, and the coal would shift and the ship would be endangered. There's a place in the middle of the Pacific below Christmas Island, Starbuck Island, and there's about 5 or 6 unnamed shipwrecks on that. They think they're probably from Newcastle. Say the main bar, the 500-ton tramp steamer, came ashore at Nobby's well before Pasha Bulker. That was in 1940, being towed, crashed there. And it stayed to haunt the beachgoers at Nobby's for about 50 years because they couldn't take it off, but they cut it down until it was nothing. But then the sand would smother it, and then people go swimming there and cut their feet.
Dr. Howard, Dick and I had the pleasure of removing the last bit of steel, and we put it in the back of his car and took it and put it in the museum.
It's recognised everywhere that Terry Callen is the name associated with Newcastle's maritime history and the history of shipwrecks in Newcastle. Terry is everywhere in this subject. He was a man of great passion, he was a man of great knowledge, and he was so motivated to tell that story, the knowledge that he had. And his work, painting artwork with such detail, is a legacy.
My name's Chris Callen. My dad was Terry Callen. Dad was what you would describe as a ship lover. He was an artist and a maritime historian.
Dad published 2 fantastic books on the history of the shipwrecks of Newcastle, Bar Dangerous and Bar Safe.
A maritime artist, he was the whole kit and caboodle with respect to shipping, one of the preeminent historians of his time.
He really had a great knowledge of all the ships that had been shipwrecked entering Newcastle Harbour. He came from a shipping family. His grandfather built ships and salvage ships, and my father loved the saving of the lives and the saving of the ships. And so the book is full of historical facts, incredible stories, intimate stories, hundreds of paintings. literally hundreds and hundreds of paintings. I lived my life with Dad sketching, even when we would go to holidays.
He did all the artwork, he did all the graphs, he did all the diagrams, and he wrote the script.
The graphs denoting where the ships are located, what their dimensions were.
He would research to the bilio to get all this information to make sure historically correct.
But yet he was very humble about that. He just had to get it right, and he had an incredible wealth of knowledge which came historically from his upbringing. At our little place in Stockton, our little corner block, we always had random people would come and he could tell them all about the ship, who was the captain, what had happened, what story it involved. The ferry captain would come with his 5 children and wife, and we'd have to entertain them. We didn't know them really.
He got a knock on the door one night, about 7 o'clock Sunday night, and there's a big rough guy there, and he said he was a diver, and thanks very much, I've been reading your books. I've got a lot of brass and bronze and stuff off that. He took him outside, there was a truck piled to the top. He'd been working for the whole weekend, blowing up propellers and stuff like that, all the ships.
Sometimes the police would arrive and that caused great consternation, but it would have to do with some unknown object that had been washed up on the beach, and they'd get him to see, was it a mine, was it a buoy, did it come from a ship, where did this piece come from? And I remember for quite a few years Dad would go on an annual trip to Canberra with the National Library to help them with their historical work with ships. Dad was the Wikipedia of shipwrecks. Before Wikipedia, he wanted to make sure that it was right and that people knew of this incredible shipwrecking history. And I can't believe that we're celebrating his work now. I feel incredibly blessed, really, and just not understand how much fuss that this would be causing.
There's a famous photograph of the Sygna storm, all the people on the beach pulling in the line. And far right of that, there's a little figure in a black coat and a white hat, standing alone, as if to say, they said, get out of the way, you're too old, you can't pull the rope. And that was Terry Callen. And he said, I've written about this for 50, 60 years, all shipwrecks. It's the first time I'd seen one. And that's why he was up there on the beach.
This was his moment to shine, participating in the rescue of the crew of the Sygna. His father had done the same thing back in his day, and so that was the highlight of his life, I would say.
From the ill-fated Sygna, Norwegian vessel that was due to load in Newcastle. Now she'll never make Newcastle. She lies, broken-backed, beyond all hope of salvage, a mere 100 yards off the shore.
1974, the major cyclone with the Sygna went aground up at North Stockton. It's gone only recently, about the last year or so.
Well, the Sygna was, I think, about a 50,000 tonne Panamax bulk carrier. The holding ground out there in bad weather is not particularly good. You have to deballast on the basis of coming into the port. That's one of the requirements. You've got to make sure you've got your propeller under the water. It would appear that he deballasted. The weather was so bad that he just drifted onto the beach.
The Sygna storm, it was extraordinary. It caused extensive damage everywhere. But conservatively, it was supposed to be up to 165 kilometres an hour. There was about 1,500 houses damaged. People just didn't expect a storm of that magnitude to strike. First real call for emergency services, later became the SES. The major thing about the Sygna was the bravery of all the helicopter crews and the other people who went out. The helicopter worked, I think, from noon till 3 in appalling conditions. And they winched up, I think it was 27 men, I think, and 2 women. They had to be careful because the waves were going about 150 feet in the air. It was extraordinary. The guy had been in Vietnam, which obviously used to a bit of drama, etc. Amazing stuff that he could get everyone off and they weren't all killed.
The salvage is well known 50 years on.
The stern was there was a guy fishing off that on and off for about 4 or 5 years. He wrote a book about it.
We decided that we wouldn't tell anybody about the book until the shipwreck had disappeared. It is gone now, and it's time that I can tell the story. We couldn't tell it while it was still there because everyone would have turned up. I'm Chris Simmons. I used to sleep and stay out on the Sygna shipwreck and fish all day, all night. It was the best spot ever. We used to paddle out on our boards. I had a grappling hook and towed a bucket and all our rods, and I'd throw the hook up, climb up the wreck, and then once we were set up, you had time to sit down and look around and take in everything, and it was being on another place. It was just unbelievable. The deck sloped two different ways, and it was really hard to sleep on at night. So I took an old hammock out and I strung it between a porthole cover and a doorway in an old cabin, and I used to sleep in my hammock. Well, at night time it took on a completely different persona. Sometimes if the wind died down enough, the rising swell underneath the wreck would compress the air and it would make all these sounds of air rushing out and air being sucked in. We used to call it the Sygna Symphony. Some nights were quiet, some nights were wild. We had some storms sometimes that we shouldn't have been out there on, but other nights with the fog and the mist and the coldness. Sometimes there was lots of stars, it was very bright, and some nights were so dark it was like living in a cave. All of a sudden, a reel would take off and you'd have a fish on. Fishing was unbelievable. We'd catch our bait out there, then we'd catch anything from luderick to bream, but the ultimate was the big jewfish at night time. That was our main goal, to get the big fish, but we always ate fish all the time. We had so many fish. The Stockton Beach is a breeding ground for great whites. We had a lot of baits that were busted off, so we imagine it was sharks, but you tried not to think too much because you had to paddle back.
So we did quite a few dives, and that was always a magnet for a lot of fish. Where one night dive once during the mullet run, it was just jam-packed with mullet. The only time the mullet cleared was when I saw a tiger shark. No mullet for a bit, but yeah, it was an interesting dive.
Sometimes we'd leave middle of the night, we'd jump in the water, be paddling in a backpack full of fish, and the phosphorescence at some nights was glowing, and you'd leave like a turtle track behind you, and you'd look behind you, you'd get to the corner of the wreck where the schools of mullet sat, and you'd frighten them, and then it was just like a frothing soup, and you'd just, oh, I'm not going to get through here. Every day, every night was just different, but great. The shipwreck itself was the perfect artificial reef. On a 32-kilometre beach, it was the only structure. Any travelling fish would stop there. It was like a hotel for them. Everything used to grow on it, which attracted the small fish, which then attracted the predators.
We often will dive and we'll find that there are fish hiding in shipwrecks. And that gives us hope that a shipwreck is a good idea as an artificial reef. They're a haven for fish, and they're an area where we see a lot of life in an otherwise barren desert. A ship that sank may have sunk with oil on board, etc., and may not be as healthy for the environment. So scuttle ships today, like the Navy ships, are cleaned out and deliberately emptied. Scuttle ships in the old days were emptied for economic reasons. They weren't going to sink a ship that still had, 2 pounds of oil in her. So they just towed her out and sank her, empty.
Well, a lot of the old shipwrecks we have here were sailing vessels, timber or iron sailing vessels. Ecologically, they're not much of a problem. Any shipwreck is an artificial reef. Diving wrecks has its interesting moments. I have seen a lot of sharks in my time. Bull sharks, tiger sharks, grey nurse sharks, wobbegongs. I've seen great white once, I've seen hammerheads a couple of times. Got bitten on the elbow by a baby bull shark, just a taste bite, a couple of teeth marks in my wetsuit. I've cut fishing line out of the mouths of grey nurse, and on the whole, I don't tend to get scared, but considering the number of dives I've done, I've had very little bad interactions with sharks.
So when it comes to shipwrecks, a lot of people just concentrate on Newcastle and the harbour and obviously the breakwall, but there's so much around. In fact, you'd rather dive out there and not be part of the traffic, I suppose, that is Newcastle Harbour.
There's an old Sydney Harbour ferry called the Paringai going up the Hunter River. You can actually see it sometimes crossing Hexham Bridge. So after the war, it was being used for a river run. It sank at its moorings. Quite interesting, I've dived it. It's all very dark and eerie because it's black, and then you get some holes in the deck and you get this sort of orange light comes through those.
Newcastle's got some great wrecks just north of it, mostly the scuttles, the Osprey and the Commodore.
One of my favourite wrecks is up in Port Stephens off Soldiers Point in Salamander Bay, a Navy ship with a lot of history called the Psyche. It accompanied some New Zealand ships out and they took command of what was German Samoa. It was then used to lug timber up at the bay and then sank, and so it's lying on its side in 14 metres of water, and it's a massive ship and you can swim up inside it.
The whole area is full of stories. Going up way past North Stockton, you've got an amphibious army tank that went down there, sank up there.
1954, during a military exercise, what was called a water buffalo, an LVT-4A, an armoured amphibious tank. The tank lies in 31 metres of water, about halfway between Newcastle Harbour and Brooby Point. They left Nobby's Beach for an overnight exercise, but while they were out, big storm hit and that was a major rescue operation.
12 sank out of 19 in 1954, 100 guys thrown in the ocean.
3 died, so that was quite tragic, especially it was just an exercise. They're not real big, and they only had about 15 centimetres freeboard. As soon as they got water in them, they sank like a brick. That exercise off Stockton Beach was the biggest non-wartime loss of life.
They're still up there, the fishermen snagged their nets on them.
But it's still got a turret, still got a gun, machine gun bullets there, and then there's fish swimming around and there's little shrimp in amongst the bullets. Inside Swansea Channel, there's a number of small wrecks before the entrance to Blackned's Bay. Further along the channel, going towards the lake, there's the wreck of the Bluebird. Now, unfortunately, all these wrecks, they get buried by sand occasionally, and they're fairly shallow, so they're not always diveable.
You head a bit south and you get past the boiler that is the Byron, and then the Bonnie, and then the Advance. That's about the collection that Newcastle's got just out wide. I'm sure there are others, and we're really excited to find others.
Behind me on Nobby's Beach lies the wreck of the Pasha Bulker. She ran aground this morning. Her crew has since been airlifted off as part of an amazing rescue operation, and tonight there's the real possibility she could break up and spill oil onto the beach.
The storm was massive, $1.4 billion worth of damage to the city and to the region, with the loss of homes and infrastructure, and 10 people lost their lives. A massive, terrifying event for this region.
So I finished the night shift, I went in to have a look at the surf, where I normally surfed, and lo and behold, here's this ship gets washed up on the reef that I surfed on.
You could see the Pasha Bulker coming through the mist, and they're talking on the radio, and they're going to send tugs out to get it off, and I thought, no, they're not.
My radio show at the ABC at the time started at 11 o'clock in the morning, so after I've stopped looking at the spectacle and actually gone to work, I was on air for hours because the station then went into 24-hour broadcasting for 3 days straight, emergency broadcasting. All hands on deck to do this. And I can remember being on my screen appeared the memo from the Department of Education that said all schools right across the region were being closed and evacuated. I've got 2 little boys at school, but you just do the job and you trust that the system and people will do the thing and my kids will be okay. And suddenly up on the screen popped a message, I'll never forget it, and I don't know who it was from. Please tell Carol her boys are safe. And it was just like, all right, I can park that over here now. I've got a phone call coming in from someone who's saying that a boy has been washed away in one of the big drains down in Lambton and Broadmeadow. There's a car down this drain. Such a privilege to work through that sort of event though for your community. You know, so grateful that I was part of that team.
It was surreal walking around the corner and seeing this ship against the normal background of the surf club and the surf. It was just this huge ship right up on the shore almost. It was just surreal.
It's Friday morning. It's already an international story about this ship that's heading for the beach in Newcastle, Australia. There's journalists coming thick and fast. The rescue helicopter was taking the crew off the ship, which was just a phenomenal thing to watch because the weather was really bad at that point and it got worse over the next sort of 24 hours. But there is a remarkable, hilarious story about one of the crew members who, when they were airlifted off and safely brought to land at the Nobby's car park, and one of my colleagues said to them, "So how are you?" And this crew member said, "Oh, we're fine, Captain's
The Ports Minister says a full investigation will be made into the decisions by the captain and the communication processes. Most of the 56 ships off Newcastle heeded the instructions and headed further out to sea to avoid the predicted severe storm conditions.
There's another 2 ships nearly lost. The local tugs got out there and managed to save them from running aground. Subsequently, when there's bad weather around, the ships that are anchored pick their anchor up and go out to sea. They don't lose their turn in the queue. That's all been regulated. That came out of the Pasha Bulker grounding.
It's a famous photograph taken from above, and it shows the Pasha Bulker there wallowing on the sand sort of thing. Fantastic shot. But people say this must be faked, it's Photoshop. It's not.
The last 15 years, this image has been viewed at least 20 million times that I've kept tabs on, and thousands of comments saying that it's fake and that I'd put the whole thing together with 2 images on Photoshop, and I should be ashamed of myself. I just saw everyone corralled down here. The place was fenced off, people were all getting very similar shots, so that's when I decided that I need to get something different, and that's why I went to the Christchurch Cathedral. Look at that vantage point, look, you can see with the boat, it's perfect. The compression that you can see here really makes it almost like a little toy world that I've created, but in fact the size of the ship really is quite well represented. So a lot of the comments that were negative about the image was this line here, and people saying it was a poor stitch on Photoshop and he couldn't even get the colour correct. But this difference in colour was the water coming out of the harbour from silt and rainwater. I've been working as a commercial photographer for over 40 years, and there's no way I would ever try to manipulate an image to create something that really was false. So it's all shot in camera and there's no Photoshop whatsoever. It's not a fake.
We're at the showground and the Maritime Museum's collection is stored here. Unfortunately, they haven't got a permanent home.
My name is Sue Thomas. I went to the Maritime Museum in 2003, initially to have a look at their database, but then immediately got involved with how beautiful the collection was. I catalogued 20,000 pieces at one stage, but that was not the entire collection at all. It goes from a whole series of magnificent models, down from tiny little Welsh coracles to the big models that came from the State Dockyard. All of the models are absolutely magnificent.
It's hard to say what's the most exciting about this collection because there are big things and little things, and there are some really exciting old relics that date way back to the very beginning. I like the rusty old parts of old wrecks that have been dredged up. I like the structural things like helms and some of the masts and booms and flags, and look, it goes on and on and on. There's so many good things here.
There are all sorts of things for navigation, apart from all the shipwreck pieces, little pieces and big pieces. We have lots of paintings by Terry Callen. If it wasn't for all the books that Terry Callen wrote and his pictures, we wouldn't be able to link a lot of that history to the articles or the items that we have in the museum, but they go together very well.
And this massive collection that we have and this massive knowledge of history needs to be presented for future generations. We need a place where we can show and tell.
History is so important, it should not be lost, and people should be able to see what made this place.
It's an amazing collection, it's huge, it shows the history of Newcastle. All of it should be displayed. There should be a dedicated maritime museum.
I would like a beautiful new building on the water, on the harbour somewhere, so that we could tell the story why Newcastle wouldn't be Newcastle without the harbour.
When Newcastle Museum helped the Newcastle Maritime Museum Society move their collection from Carrington to various other sites in the city, we took on some of the nationally significant objects, and that included the Victoria lifeboat and the Rocket Brigade wagon.
It's the last remaining lifeboat of its class in the Southern Hemisphere. Victoria lifeboat, it's part of Newcastle's history, it's part of its heritage. It belongs to the city. And the Lifeboat Rescue Service saved hundreds of lives. So it deserves to be remembered, it deserves to be saved.
So we got some conservators that are top of their game to come and assess the condition of both the wagon and the Victoria. We found some really wonderful shipwrights over at Carrington who, probably like the last generation of blokes that were trained on timber vessels. So we've stabilised it, we've got it sort of up on blocks, so to speak. Eventually, we'll have it on display at Newcastle Museum.
We've only been able to dive the ones within recreational divers' range of depth. There must be many, many more deeper out in the coast.
So we've got wrecks here that range from about 4 or 5 metres deep to wrecks that are up around 60.
The bottom time at 61 metres is incredibly short, and it requires mixed gases to decompress on the way back up. So you can understand that sort of depth and that sort of training, only a few people can do that. Some of these wrecks are deeper than we could go, but we're very interested to say, what is that? That's way out in the 99 metre range. So there's a lot more that hasn't been found that's still sitting out there, waiting for a drone or something like that to go down and find it.